Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo the loudest across the wilderness. When everyone else walked past suffering, one man stopped to care. Caleb Miller was nothing more than a lowly stable hand, ridiculed daily by fellow workers for sharing his meager rations with a runty stray donkey that limped along the ranch's edge. The other hands called him soft, foolish, wasteful. But one quiet morning, something impossible happened that would silence every mockery. 4 magnificent wild mustangs, the legendary Phantom Bachelor herd that had evaded capture for decades, walked calmly into the corral and surrounded Caleb and his donkey. What could make the wildest horses in the territory willingly surrender their freedom to one humble cowboy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Broken Spur Ranch stretched across the high desert of New Mexico territory like a weathered saddle blanket, its boundaries marked by nothing more than fence posts and the unspoken understanding that a man's word still meant something in 1887. The ranch house sat squat and defiant against the wind, adobe walls thick enough to keep the summer heat at bay and the winter cold from settling into a man's bones. Beyond it, the bunkhouse slouched in perpetual need of repair, and further still, the stables stood as the only structure on the property that received regular maintenance. Horses, after all, were worth more than the men who tended them. Caleb Miller understood this truth better than most. At 43 years old, he occupied the lowest rung of ranch hierarchy, a position he'd held for the better part of 5 years. The other hands called him Oates, with a mixture of mockery and dismissal, the nickname born from his singular obsession with ensuring every horse under his care received proper feed, even when it meant going without himself. He'd arrived at the Broken Spur with nothing but the clothes on his back and a story he never told, taking the only job available to a man past his prime with no references and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen more than he cared to remember. His quarters consisted of a corner in the tack room that smelled perpetually of leather oil and hay dust, a narrow cot, a trunk containing 2 changes of clothes, and a shelf that held a battered Bible and a photograph he kept face down were the sum total of his possessions. Well, those, and the worn leather pouch he kept in his shirt pocket close to his heart. The pouch had once been fine craftsmanship, the kind a man might receive as a gift from someone who loved him. Now it was cracked and faded, held together by a strip of rawhide he'd braided himself. Inside, $3 silver and a handful of pennies represented his entire savings, his wages minus what he spent on extra feed. The other ranch hands found this amusing. "There goes Oates again," Red Jeffries would announce whenever Caleb passed through the bunkhouse on his way to the stables. Red was thick-shouldered and thick-headed in equal measure, a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists or ignore with whiskey. "Off to count his fortune, I reckon." "Don't spend it all in one place," Buck Ramsey would add, his laugh sharp as broken glass. Buck was the lead wrangler, a position that came with authority he wielded like a club. 20 years Caleb's junior and twice as mean, he'd made it clear from Caleb's first day that stable hands existed to serve, not to think. Caleb never responded to their jibes. He'd learned long ago that some men carried anger like a disease, spreading it to anyone who got too close. Better to keep your head down and your hands busy. The horses didn't judge him. The horses didn't care that he'd fallen from grace or that grace had been so far up he'd broken himself on the landing. Every morning Caleb rose before dawn, that quiet hour when the world held its breath between darkness and light. He'd splash water on his face from the basin outside the tack room, run wet fingers through hair more grey than brown, and make his way to the stables. The routine never varied. Check each horse for signs of distress or injury, distribute feed and water, muck out stalls with the same methodical care a surgeon might take with a scalpel. By the time the other hands stumbled from the bunkhouse, rubbing sleep from their eyes and complaining about sore heads, Caleb had already completed half a day's work. The broken spur maintained 15 horses, 10 working mounts for ranch hands, 3 breeding mares, and 2 stallions kept separated from the general population. Each horse had quirks and preferences that Caleb had learned through patient observation. The bay gelding named Copper favored his left foreleg and needed extra attention after long rides. The roan mare called Duchess had been badly treated before arriving at the ranch and still flinched when men raised their voices. Caleb spoke to her in low, steady tones and never approached her right side too quickly. This attention to detail earned him grudging respect from the horses and continued mockery from the men. "You treat them animals better than you treat yourself," old Silas had observed one afternoon. Silas was the ranch cook, a man whose friendship with whiskey had cost him his position as a trail boss 15 years prior. He'd softened since those days, his anger fermented into melancholy. "Ain't natural, the way you hover over them like a mother hen. Horses don't lie to you," Caleb had replied, the most he'd said about his philosophy in 3 years of working alongside Silas. "Feed them regular, treat them fair, and they'll give you everything they've got. More than you can say for most folks." Silas had nodded slowly, recognizing a truth forged in disappointment. He'd left Caleb to his work without further comment. It was on a Tuesday morning in late September when the donkey first appeared. Caleb had stepped outside the stable to dump a bucket of dirty water when movement along the fence line caught his eye. A small grey form limped through the sage brush, ribs visible even at a distance. The animal moved with the painful determination of a creature that hadn't given up but couldn't remember why it was still trying. Caleb set down his bucket and watched. The donkey, a young jack, by the look of him stopped every few steps to rest, his head hanging low. One of his ears had been torn, probably by a mountain lion or a pack of coyotes that had decided he wasn't worth finishing off. His coat was matted with dirt and old blood, and when the wind shifted, Caleb caught the smell of infection. "Well," Caleb said quietly to himself, "guess you've had yourself a rough time of it." He walked slowly toward the animal, making no sudden movements. The donkey's good ear swiveled toward him, tracking his approach. Wild animals ran from people. Domestic animals that had been mistreated often did the same. But this donkey simply stood there, watching Caleb with dark, liquid eyes that held a depth of exhaustion Caleb recognized. It was the look of someone who'd run out of places to go. "Easy now," Caleb murmured, stopping 10 feet away. "I'm not going to hurt you. You look like you could use a friend." The donkey made no sound, didn't bray or snort or show any of the defensive behavior Caleb expected. He simply stood there, swaying slightly, as if waiting to see whether this human would prove different from the ones who'd abandoned him to die. Caleb pulled his leather pouch from his shirt pocket and fished out one of his silver dollars. The nearest town was 5 miles away, and the general store there charged premium prices for everything. But infection didn't wait for payday, and a wounded animal deserved better than suffering. "I'll be back," he told the donkey. "You stay right there." He made the walk to town in under 2 hours, purchased a tin of wound salve and a bag of oats with his silver dollar, and returned to find the donkey exactly where he'd left him. This time, Caleb approached close enough to touch. The donkey flinched but didn't bolt. Caleb cleaned the infected wounds with water from the horse trough, applied the salve with gentle fingers, and set out a small pile of oats. The donkey stared at the food as if he'd forgotten what it was for. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and began to eat. He ate the way starving creatures do, with a desperate single-mindedness that made Caleb's chest tight. "That's it," Caleb said softly. "Take your time. There'll be more tomorrow." This exchange, this small act of mercy, extended to a creature the world had discarded, would change everything. But Caleb didn't know that yet. He only knew that he'd looked into the donkey's eyes and seen something familiar, the bone-deep weariness of being unwanted, the quiet dignity of still standing despite every reason to lie down and quit. Over the following weeks, the donkey became a fixture at the edge of ranch property. He never came all the way in, but he never wandered far either. Each morning, Caleb would find him in roughly the same spot, waiting. Caleb would bring oats, not much, just a handful from the bag he kept hidden in the tack room, purchased with money that should have gone toward a new shirt or a hot meal in town. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. Men who worked outdoors developed an awareness of their surroundings that bordered on supernatural. Nothing happened on ranch property without someone noticing and everyone else hearing about it by supper. "Oats is feeding a damn donkey now," Red announced one evening in the bunkhouse, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Using horse feed, I reckon. Stealing from the ranch to coddle some broken-down jackass. Takes one to know one," Buck added, and several men laughed. Caleb, cleaning tack in his corner of the stable, heard every word. The walls between buildings on a ranch were never as thick as people imagined. He methodically worked oil into a bridle's leather, his face showing nothing. He'd learned that lesson too: never let them see they've gotten to you. Every reaction was a victory for men who measured their worth in the discomfort of others. But in the privacy of his own thoughts, Caleb wondered what it said about a man's life when feeding a starving animal was considered the worst thing he'd done that day. The donkey healed slowly. The wounds closed, the torn ear scarred over, and weight gradually returned to his frame. By October, he looked less like death warmed over and more like what he'd probably been before hardship found him: a sturdy, compact animal with intelligent eyes and a surprising gentleness. Caleb had taken to calling him Dust for the color of his coat and the way he appeared each morning through the desert haze, like a ghost materializing from memory. Dust never came into the stable proper. He maintained his distance, as if understanding that the building belonged to the horses and he was merely a visitor at the margins. But the distance shrank week by week. 30 yards became 20, 20 became 10. By the time November's cold nights arrived, Dust had taken to sleeping just outside the stable's open side door, close enough that Caleb could hear him breathing in the darkness. "You're a peculiar one," Caleb told him one night, leaning against the doorframe and looking out at the stars. "Most animals, you show them kindness, they take it and move on. But you keep hanging around like you're waiting for something." Dust's ear rotated toward Caleb's voice, but he didn't move from where he lay in the dirt. In the moonlight, his eyes reflected silver. "Well," Caleb continued, "I suppose we're both waiting for something. Difference is, I don't rightly know what I'm waiting for anymore. Think I forgot somewhere along the way." The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere out in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack. The sound was mournful and ancient, a reminder that wildness still existed beyond the fragile boundaries humans drew around themselves. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and went back inside. He didn't see the 4 shapes that stood motionless in the tree line a quarter-mile away, their heads raised and their attention fixed on the stable where a man spoke gently to a donkey while the rest of the ranch slept. He didn't know they'd been watching for weeks, these phantom horses that legends were built from. He didn't know they were waiting, too, for a sign that would answer the question every wild creature must eventually ask: is this human different? Tomorrow would bring that answer. But tonight, Caleb simply checked each horse one final time, banked the small fire he wasn't supposed to keep burning in the tack room, and lay down on his cot with the leather pouch under his thin pillow. $3 silver and some pennies, not much to show for 43 years of living. But he'd spent his money on salve and oats, and somehow that seemed like enough. The morning arrived wrapped in fog, unusual for the high desert, but not unheard of, when cold air met the last warmth of autumn. Caleb woke to silence, not the comfortable quiet of early morning, but the profound hush that falls when every living thing holds its breath. Even the rooster that normally announced dawn with aggressive punctuality remained mute. Caleb sat up on his cot, instantly alert. 5 years of ranch work had attuned his senses to anything out of place, and this silence felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his coat, and stepped out of the tack room into the stable proper. The horses were awake, every one of them standing at attention in their stalls, Their ears were pricked forward, their heads high, their bodies tense with an awareness that sent prickles across Caleb's scalp. Copper, the bay gelding who usually greeted mornings with resigned indifference, trembled with barely contained energy. Duchess, the skittish roan mare, stood perfectly still for the first time since Caleb had known her, her dark eyes fixed on something beyond the stable walls. "What's got into you all?" Caleb murmured, moving down the center aisle. He checked each stall as he passed, looking for signs of illness or injury, but found nothing amiss. The horses simply stared at the open side door where Dust usually slept, their attention focused with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Caleb reached the doorway and looked out into the fog-shrouded morning. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then the fog shifted, and his breath caught in his chest. 4 horses stood in the corral, motionless as statues carved from morning mist. Not horses, mustangs. Wild ones by the look of them, with no brands marring their hides and no halters gentling their bearing. They stood in a loose semicircle, facing the stable, and in the center of that semicircle sat Dust, his small grey form dwarfed by the magnificent animals surrounding him. Caleb's mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. The corral gate stood open, though he'd closed it the night before. No tracks showed in the dirt to indicate how the mustangs had arrived, as if they'd materialized from the fog itself. But most impossibly, these wild creatures showed no fear, no tension, no inclination to bolt. They simply waited, their dark eyes fixed on the stable doorway where Caleb stood frozen in disbelief. The lead stallion stood slightly ahead of the others, a bay with a black mane and tail, standing perhaps 15 hands high. His chest was broad, his legs clean and strong, his bearing noble in a way that transcended simple genetics. This was an animal that had never known a rope or a bit, never felt the weight of a rider or the confinement of a stall. Freedom showed in every line of his body, and yet here he stood, calm as a barn cat, waiting for something Caleb couldn't fathom. To the stallion's left stood a dappled grey, slightly smaller but no less impressive. His coat caught the early light and threw it back in shades of silver. To the right, a sorrel with 4 white socks and a blaze that ran crooked down his face, giving him a rakish appearance. And behind them all, a buckskin with a black dorsal stripe and primitive zebra stripes on his legs, markings that spoke of old bloodlines running true. Caleb knew these horses. Every ranch hand in New Mexico territory knew of them, though few claimed to have seen them. The Phantom Bachelor Herd, they were called. 4 young stallions that ran together in defiance of natural behavior that usually scattered young males to solitary wandering. They'd evaded capture for years, slipping through traps and outrunning pursuit with almost supernatural ease. Men had tracked them into canyons, only to find them vanished. Ranchers had set up ambushes at water sources and found nothing but hoofprints by morning. Some said they were smart, others said they were lucky. A few old-timers who'd worked horses all their lives swore they were something more, creatures that existed in that liminal space between wild and knowing, understanding humans well enough to avoid them completely. And now they stood in Caleb Miller's corral like they'd been invited to breakfast. Caleb took a step forward, moving slowly, his hands visible and empty. The mustang's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement, but none of them spooked. Dust raised his head and let out a soft bray, not the harsh, grating sound of distress, but a gentle call that sounded almost like welcome. The lead bay nickered in response. The sound was low and rumbling, a friendly greeting between herd members. Then, impossibly, the stallion took 3 steps forward and lowered his head, stretching his neck toward Caleb in the universal equine gesture of trust. Caleb's hands shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the rope halter he'd spent the past week braiding from old lead ropes he'd found discarded in the tack room. He'd made it for Dust, thinking perhaps the donkey might eventually let him come close enough to slip it on. The braiding had taken him several evenings, his fingers clumsy at first, but gradually remembering skills he'd once possessed. It wasn't fancy work, just simple three-strand braiding with a loop for the nose and a longer end for leading, but he'd made every knot with care. He hadn't expected to use it on a Mustang stallion worth more than 3 years of his wages. "Easy now," Caleb breathed, extending his hand palm up. "I don't know what you're doing here, or why you picked this particular morning to lose your wild good sense, but I'm not about to look a gift horse in the mouth." The stallion snorted softly, his breath warm against Caleb's palm. This close, Caleb could see the intelligence in those dark eyes, the assessment being made. The horse was evaluating him, measuring him against some criteria only the animal understood. Whatever test was being administered, Caleb stood still and let it happen. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't force trust, you could only offer yourself honestly and hope it was enough. The moment stretched. Behind Caleb, he heard movement as one of the stable horses shifted in his stall. The sound seemed to break whatever spell held the morning suspended. The bay stallion pushed his nose into Caleb's hand, not hard but firmly, as if sealing some agreement neither of them had spoken aloud. Caleb slipped the rope halter over the stallion's head with hands that had steadied. The horse accepted it without protest, standing quietly while Caleb adjusted the fit and tied off the lead rope. The other 3 mustangs watched this transaction with apparent approval, their bodies relaxed, their attention unwavering. "Well," Caleb said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he didn't fully understand. "I suppose you boys are hungry." He led the bay stallion toward the stable, the rope barely taut between them. The horse followed willingly, his hooves striking the packed dirt with solid, confident thuds. The other 3 mustangs fell in behind, forming a procession that would have seemed absurd if it wasn't happening. Dust brought up the rear, his short legs working hard to keep pace, his expression, if a donkey could have an expression, remarkably smug. By the time they reached the stable door, the fog had begun to lift. The rising sun painted the clouds in shades of rose and gold, and in that morning light, Caleb saw what he'd missed in the darkness and mist. In the tree line a quarter-mile away, the sagebrush had been trampled in a wide circle, as if something had been stationed there for quite some time. The mustangs hadn't appeared this morning. They'd been out there watching, waiting, studying the man who'd shown kindness to the small grey donkey the herd had sent ahead as their scout. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. Dust wasn't a stray. He'd never been abandoned or lost. He'd been placed, deliberately sent to test the waters, to see if this ranch and this man might be different from all the others. And every morning when Caleb had brought oats, every gentle word spoken in the darkness, every careful tending of wounds, all of it had been observed and evaluated. The mustangs hadn't surrendered their freedom. They'd chosen him. Behind him, the bunkhouse door slammed open. Red Jeffrey stumbled out, still half asleep, his suspenders hanging loose. He took 3 steps toward the outhouse before his brain registered what his eyes were seeing. He stopped so abruptly he nearly fell over. "Buck!" Red's voice cracked like thin ice. "Buck, get out here. You need to see this." More doors opened. More men emerged, rubbing sleep from their eyes and reaching for boots. Within minutes, every hand on the Broken Spur Ranch stood in a loose semicircle, staring at Caleb Miller as he led 4 phantom horses into the stable, a donkey trotting at his heels, the morning sun turning everything to gold. Nobody spoke. What words could possibly match the moment? The poorest, most ridiculed man on the ranch had somehow accomplished what professional wranglers and legendary trackers had failed to do for years. He'd captured the uncapturable simply by feeding a donkey nobody else thought was worth noticing. Caleb led the bay stallion to an empty stall and removed the rope halter. The horse walked in calmly, turned around, and looked at Caleb with what might have been approval. The other 3 mustangs followed suit, each claiming a stall, settling in as if they'd lived there all their lives. Dust waited by the door, his head high, his torn ear swiveling to catch every sound. Caleb walked over to him and knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the small grey donkey who'd changed everything. "You're smarter than all of us put together, aren't you?" Caleb said softly. Dust bumped his nose against Caleb's chest, right over the pocket where the leather pouch rested. The message was clear. You shared what you had when you had nothing to spare. You saw me when I was invisible. You earned this. Caleb stood up and turned to face the assembled ranch hands. Every eye was on him, measuring, calculating, recalibrating their understanding of who Caleb Miller was and what he might be capable of. In Buck Ramsey's expression, Caleb saw something he hadn't seen before, the first seeds of envy taking root. The silence broke when old Silas began to laugh, a rusty sound that built until his whole body shook. "I'll be damned," he wheezed. "I'll be good and truly damned. Oates, you magnificent fool, you just became the richest man in New Mexico territory, and you did it with pocket change and oats." The morning had changed everything. But as Caleb would soon learn, having something valuable wasn't the same as being allowed to keep it. News traveled fast in ranch country, carried on wind and whispers, and the telegraph wire that connected scattered communities across the territory. By noon, riders from neighboring spreads had arrived at the broken spur, ostensibly to borrow tools or discuss cattle prices, but really to see if the rumors could possibly be true. By evening, the ranch owner himself, Marcus Dalton, a man who typically visited his property once a month, if the weather was good, had ridden in from Santa Fe with his lawyer in tow. Caleb spent the day doing what he always did, tending horses. The 4 mustangs required no special handling beyond what good sense dictated. They ate the hay he provided, drank from the troughs, and allowed him to move among them with a calm acceptance that bordered on the uncanny. The bay stallion Caleb had taken to thinking of him as captain, for the commanding way he held himself followed Caleb with his eyes, tracking every movement with keen interest. "You're trying to figure me out," Caleb said as he mucked out the stall, working around the stallion with practiced efficiency. "Well, that makes 2 of us. I still can't quite believe you're here." Captain lowered his head and blew warm breath across Caleb's shoulder. The gesture felt deliberate, like an answer to an unspoken question. Caleb paused in his work and reached up slowly to touch the stallion's neck. The horse's coat was thick and healthy, unmarred by scars or poor treatment. This was an animal who'd lived well in the wild, eating clean grass and drinking from mountain streams, running free across territory that stretched farther than most men would travel in a lifetime. And he'd given it all up for oats and a rope halter and a stable hand who smelled like leather oil and old regrets. "I don't understand it," Caleb admitted quietly, "but I'm grateful. More grateful than I can say." He felt eyes on him and turned to find Buck Ramsey leaning against the stable wall, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. Buck had avoided him all morning, keeping to his duties with unusual diligence. But now, with most of the curious visitors departed and the afternoon sun slanting through the stable doors, he'd finally approached. "Got a minute?" "Oats?" Buck's voice carried none of its usual mockery. That worried Caleb more than anger would have. "Sure." Caleb set aside his pitchfork and brushed hay dust from his sleeves. "What's on your mind?" Buck glanced toward the ranch house where Marcus Dalton was visible through a window, gesturing emphatically while his lawyer took notes. "There's going to be talk about ownership. You know that, right?" "Figured as much. The horses came onto ranch property. Dalton's going to argue that makes them his by rights of capture." Caleb had expected this. Property law in the territory was straightforward about livestock. What wandered onto your land could be claimed, especially wild animals with no existing brand or owner. But these horses hadn't wandered. They'd chosen. "They're not exactly captured," Caleb said mildly. "They walked in of their own accord, into my corral, through a gate I'd opened. Dalton's corral, technically. Dalton's gate. Dalton's ranch." Buck shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I'm not saying I agree with it. Hell, everyone saw what happened. You earned this. But the law's not always about what's fair. Then what's it about?" "Power." Buck's laugh was bitter. "Always has been. Man like Dalton, he's got lawyers and money and friends in Santa Fe. Man like you." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Man like you's got nothing but what he can hold on to. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd lost everything once before to men with lawyers and money and power. He'd sworn he'd never put himself in that position again, which is why he'd chosen this life, small, simple, below notice. But the mustangs had changed that. They'd elevated him from invisible to valuable, and value always attracted attention. "Appreciate the warning," Caleb said. Buck nodded and started to leave, then paused. "One more thing. There's men asking questions in town. About you. Where you came from. What you did before you showed up here." The cold in Caleb's chest spread. What kind of men? The curious kind. The kind that smell money and want to know if there's more to the story. Buck met Caleb's eyes directly for the first time in their conversation. "You got secrets, Oates. We all knew that. But nobody cared because you were nobody. Now," he gestured toward the stalls where the mustangs stood like captured sunlight. "Now people are going to care. They're going to dig." After Buck left, Caleb stood alone in the stable's golden afternoon light, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He walked to the tack room and opened his trunk with hands that had gone steady again through sheer force of will. Beneath his spare shirt and the Bible, he found what he was looking for, a small brass nameplate tarnished with age that read, "Captain Caleb J. Miller, 7th Cavalry Regiment." He'd been somebody once. Not just a stable hand, but an officer, a man who'd led troops and made decisions that determined whether men lived or died. That had been before the war ended, and he'd come home to find nothing left worth leading and no place in a world that had moved on without him. Before the drinking started, before his wife left, before he'd lost the small ranch they'd built together to debts he couldn't pay and pride he couldn't swallow. The nameplate had been a gift on his promotion, presented by his commanding officer with words about honor and duty and service. Caleb had kept it through everything that followed, a reminder of who he'd been and how far he'd fallen. Now he held it in his palm and wondered if his past was about to become everyone's present. He heard footsteps approaching, slow, measured, the gait of someone who didn't need to announce themselves because their authority preceded them. Marcus Dalton appeared in the tackroom doorway, a man in his 60s who wore his wealth like a well-tailored suit. His lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and a leather portfolio, stood slightly behind him. "Miller," Dalton said by way of greeting. His eyes dropped to the nameplate in Caleb's hand, lingered there a moment, then rose back to Caleb's face. "Captain Miller, I should say. Interesting detail you've neglected to mention in 5 years of employment." Caleb set the nameplate back in the trunk and closed the lid. "Didn't seem relevant to mucking stalls." "No, I suppose it didn't." Dalton stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. "We need to discuss those horses." "I figured we would. They're valuable, extremely valuable. The right buyer would pay well, let's just say more than you'd make in 10 years of working for me. That why you rode out from Santa Fe? To discuss how much they're worth?" Dalton smiled, but his eyes remained calculating. "I rode out because I'm a businessman, Captain, and I see opportunity. Those horses came onto my property. By law, I could claim them. But I'm not an unreasonable man. You have a relationship with them that I don't. They trust you. That trust is valuable in itself." Dalton glanced at his lawyer, who produced a document from his portfolio. "I'm prepared to offer you a partnership. We sell the horses together, split the proceeds 60-40. You get 40%, more money than you'd see otherwise, and I get fair compensation for the property they occupied and the feed they'll consume." Caleb looked at the document without touching it. "And if I don't want to sell, then we have a problem." Dalton's voice remained pleasant, but steel ran beneath the velvet. "Because one way or another, those horses will leave this ranch. The only question is whether you leave with money in your pocket or with nothing at all except the memory of what might have been." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Dalton is being quite generous, Mr. Miller. I've reviewed the property laws thoroughly. The horses are, strictly speaking, his by right of capture. He's under no legal obligation to offer you anything." Caleb leaned back against his trunk, his arms crossed. 5 years ago, he would have gotten angry. 3 years ago, he would have folded immediately, grateful for whatever scraps fell from the table. But something had changed in him, hardened like leather left in the sun. Maybe it was the years of quiet work. Maybe it was the donkey who'd chosen to trust him. Maybe it was the mustangs standing in their stalls, proof that sometimes the universe rewarded patience instead of power. "I'll need time to think about it," Caleb said. Dalton's smile thinned. "Of course, but don't think too long, Captain. Opportunities have a way of expiring when you don't seize them promptly." After they left, Caleb sat on his cot and pulled out his leather pouch, $2 and some pennies now he'd spent one on Dust's medicine. Not much leverage against lawyers and property law. But the horses hadn't come to Marcus Dalton, they'd come to him. That had to mean something. That had to count for something. He just hoped it counted for enough. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He lay on his cot, listening to the horses breathe, their presence in the stable a comfort and a weight in equal measure. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps and tensed, hand moving instinctively toward the pitchfork leaning against the wall. But it was only Silas, carrying a flask and 2 tin cups. "Figured you might be awake," the old cook said, settling himself on an upturned bucket. He poured whiskey into both cups and handed one to Caleb. "Figured you might need this too." Caleb accepted the cup but didn't drink immediately. "Come to tell me I'm a fool for not taking Dalton's offer? Come to tell you a story." Silas took a sip from his cup, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. "Back in '71, I was working a spread up in Colorado. Owner was a man named Haskins, meaner than a snake and twice as slippery. One of the hands' Mexican fellow named Rodrigo found a cave on the property. Inside that cave was a vein of silver, thick as your arm. Let me guess, Haskins claimed it was his by virtue of owning the land. That's exactly what he did. Took the case to court, had lawyers argue that everything under the ground belonged to the man who held the deed above it. Rodrigo fought back, said he'd found it through his own skill and labor, that discovery ought to count for something. Judge ruled in Haskins' favor. Silas stared into his cup. Rodrigo disappeared a week later. Some said he went back to Mexico. Others reckoned Haskins made sure he wouldn't cause any more trouble. "Comforting story," Caleb said dryly. "Wasn't finished." Silas raised his rheumy eyes to meet Caleb's. "That mine played out inside 6 months. Haskins spent everything he had, developing it, hired engineers and bought equipment, went into debt expecting to strike it rich. When the silver ran dry, the debts came due. Lost the ranch, lost everything. Last I heard, he was sweeping floors in a Denver saloon." He paused. "Sometimes the universe takes care of things in its own time, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the Haskins of the world win and keep on winning." "True enough." Silas stood, his knees popping with the effort. "But here's what I came to tell you, Oates. Those horses didn't come to Marcus Dalton. They came to you. If there's any justice in this world, that's got to mean something. And if there ain't any justice, well, then it still means something. Just maybe not in a court of law." After Silas left, Caleb finally drank the whiskey. It burned going down, cheap stuff that Silas bought in bulk, but it steadied him. He thought about Haskins and Rodrigo, about silver veins and property deeds, about all the ways the law could be twisted to serve those who could afford to twist it. Then he thought about the bay stallion watching him from the stall, trusting him, and he made a decision. The next morning Caleb rose before dawn as always, but instead of beginning his usual routine, he walked to town. The 5-mile journey gave him time to think, to rehearse what he needed to say, to prepare for disappointment. By the time he reached the territorial land office, the sun had risen, and his resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. The clerk behind the desk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and the distracted air of someone who spent more time with ledgers than people. He looked up as Caleb entered, his expression shifting from boredom to mild interest. "Help you with something?" "Need to file a claim," Caleb said. "Property came onto land I was occupying. Want to make sure the record's clear about how and when it happened." The clerk pulled out a form, his pen poised. What kind of property? 4 horses, wild mustangs. They entered a corral under my direct supervision on the morning of November 23rd, 1887. The clerk's pen stopped moving. You're the fellow from the broken spur? Everyone's talking about it. Then you know it's true. Knowing and proving are different things. You got witnesses? 20 men saw it happen. The whole ranch was there. The clerk made notes, his expression thoughtful. You're claiming them by right of capture? Claiming them by right of relationship. They came to me specifically. Wouldn't have come to anyone else. That's unusual. Don't know if there's precedent for that. The clerk rummaged through a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick, leather-bound volume. Let me check something. Caleb waited while the young man flipped through pages, his finger tracing lines of text. The office smelled of paper and dust, and the peculiar mustiness of documents aging in dry air. Through the window, Caleb could see townspeople going about their morning business, unaware that his entire future was being decided by whatever was written in that old book. Here, the clerk said finally, tapping a page. Territory of New Mexico, case from 1879. Farmer named Sutton had a problem with wild turkeys eating his corn. He spent weeks building an elaborate trap. The day he finished it, his neighbor fellow named Morris walked over and scared the turkeys into the trap, then claimed them as his. Court ruled in favor of Sutton, saying the preparation and intention mattered more than who technically performed the final act of capture. So you prepared for those horses even if you didn't know you were doing it. You fed that donkey, built trust, created the circumstances that allowed capture to occur. That's got to count for something. The clerk began writing again, his pen moving quickly. I'll file this claim. Won't stop Marcus Dalton from filing his own, but it'll establish that you got here first and had good reason. What do I owe you? $2 for the filing fee. Caleb pulled out his leather pouch and counted out the money, all of it, every coin he had left. The clerk took it, made change, then paused before handing the coins back. Keep it, Caleb said. Consider it payment for the research. The clerk's face reddened. I can't do that, it's not proper. Then consider it a gift, from one man who respects what books and records can do to another. Caleb pushed the coins across the desk. Use it for something useful. He walked back to the ranch with a receipt in his pocket and nothing else. The leather pouch that had held his last money now held only a piece of paper and the weight of what it represented. He'd made his stand. Whether it would be enough, only time would tell. When he arrived back at the ranch, he found Marcus Dalton waiting in the stable, stroking Captain's neck with casual possessiveness. The lawyer stood nearby, that infernal portfolio under his arm. I heard you went to town, Dalton said without preamble. Filed some kind of claim. Within my rights, Caleb replied evenly. Legally, perhaps, but practically? Dalton's hand continued its steady motion along the stallion's neck. You're forcing me into a position I'd rather avoid. I offered partnership. You chose confrontation. I chose to protect what's mine. Nothing's yours until the territorial court says it is. And I guarantee you, Captain Miller, when that day comes, you won't like the ruling. If you want anything from those horses, you'll have to take me to court and win, and we both know how that's likely to end. After Dalton left, Caleb stood in the stable surrounded by horses his own and the ones that might not be, and felt the weight of choices made and consequences arriving. He'd been backed into corners before. He'd fought his way out sometimes and failed others. The difference now was that he wasn't fighting for himself alone. 4 wild horses had chosen to trust him. A small grey donkey had led them there. He owed them more than surrender. Captain moved to the stall door and nickered softly. Caleb walked over and placed his hand on the stallion's face, feeling the warmth, the life, the trust that had brought them together. I won't let you down, he promised. Whatever it takes, I won't let them turn you into something you're not. The horse pressed against his palm, and Caleb chose to believe it was agreement. In the corner where Dust stood watching, The small donkey's ears were pricked forward, attentive, as if he too understood that the real fight was just beginning. 3 days passed, with the tension of a drawn bowstring waiting to snap. Caleb continued his work, though the other ranch hands treated him differently now, some with grudging respect, others with barely concealed resentment at how an outcast had suddenly become the center of attention. Buck kept his distance. Red made snide comments just loud enough to be heard, but too soft to confront directly. Only Silas remained constant, bringing coffee in the mornings and conversation in the evenings. The mustangs settled into stable life with surprising ease. They accepted feed and water, tolerated grooming, and allowed Caleb to handle their hooves with the patience of horses raised in captivity. Yet something wild persisted in them, a quality in their eyes that said they could leave any time they chose, and there wasn't a fence built that could hold them if they decided to go. Caleb understood that quality. He saw it in the mirror every morning, that tension between staying and leaving, between accepting what life offered and walking away from it all. He'd stayed because he had nowhere else to go. They stayed because, well, he still wasn't entirely sure why, but he was grateful for it. On the 4th morning, a woman appeared at the stable just after dawn. She rode a neat sorrel mare and carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Her riding clothes were practical but well made, and her face, though lined with years, held the kind of beauty that age enhances rather than diminishes. "You're Caleb Miller," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Caleb set down the bucket he'd been carrying and wiped his hands on his pants. "Can I help you with something?" "I'm Margaret Sutton. I own the Silver Creek Ranch, about 20 miles north of here." She dismounted in one fluid motion and tied her mare to the rail. "I came to see these famous horses everyone's talking about." Caleb hesitated. Visitors had become common, but most were men looking to assess value or judge his chances in the coming legal fight. A woman rancher was unusual, though not unheard of in territory where widows often inherited operations and proved themselves capable of running them. "They're just horses," he said carefully. "Nothing's ever just anything, Mr. Miller." She walked past him toward the stable, and Caleb followed. When she saw the mustangs, she stopped so abruptly he almost ran into her. "My God, the Phantom Herd. I thought they were legend. They're real enough. And they've got names now: Captain, Sterling, Blaze, and Ranger." Margaret approached Captain's stall slowly, her hand extended. The stallion regarded her with calm assessment, then allowed her to touch his nose. She stood there for a long moment, her hand on the horse's face, her expression distant. "My husband tracked these horses for 2 years before he died," she said quietly. "He was obsessed with them. Thought if he could catch them, train them, it would make his reputation. He was a good man, but a stubborn one, and he couldn't accept that some things aren't meant to be caught." She pulled her hand back. "He died in a canyon trying to trap them. His horse fell. The mustangs got away, and he didn't. I'm sorry. Don't be. He died doing what he loved, which is more than most people manage." She turned to face Caleb directly. "I came because I heard what Marcus Dalton's trying to do. I also heard you filed a counterclaim." "Yes, ma'am." "That takes courage. Dalton's got half the territorial legislature in his pocket and lawyers who could argue black into white. You're going to need help." Caleb felt hope stir despite his better judgment. "What kind of help?" The legal kind, the financial kind. The kind that comes from someone who understands what it means when an animal chooses you instead of the other way around. She pulled a card from her pocket and handed it to him. "This is my lawyer in Santa Fe. He's good and he's honest, which is a rare combination. Tell him I sent you, and he'll take your case. I can't afford. He'll work on contingency. If you win, you pay him from the settlement. If you lose, you owe nothing." She smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "My husband spent our money chasing these horses. Seems fitting that I spend some more making sure they end up where they belong." After she left, Caleb stood holding her card, trying to understand why a stranger would involve herself in his problems. But then he looked at Captain and understood. The horses had done something to Margaret Sutton's husband that couldn't be undone, but maybe helping Caleb was a way of making peace with that loss. Maybe it was her way of ensuring the mustangs found the home her husband had never been able to give them. That evening, Caleb pulled out the photograph he kept at the bottom of his trunk. It showed a younger version of himself in cavalry dress blues, standing next to a woman with dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. Sarah. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been his wife for 6 years before the war and 2 years after, before she'd finally had enough of his drinking and his nightmares and his inability to be the man she'd married. "I can't watch you destroy yourself," she'd said the day she left. "I love you, Caleb, but I can't love you enough for both of us. You have to want to save yourself, and right now, you don't." She'd been right. He hadn't wanted to save himself. He'd wanted to drown in whiskey and forget everything he'd seen and done in the war. It had taken losing everything, her, the ranch, his self-respect, before he'd finally climbed out of the bottle and looked around at what remained. By then, she'd remarried and moved to California, and he'd been too proud and too ashamed to try to contact her. But he'd stopped drinking. One day at a time, he'd stopped. And he'd taken this job at the Broken Spur because it asked nothing of him except the kind of honest work a man could do without thinking too hard about past failures. The horses didn't care about his history. They didn't judge. They just needed care and got fed and water and the kind of steady presence that came from someone who understood what it meant to survive when everything said you shouldn't. Now these mustangs had chosen him, and maybe it was the universe's way of saying he'd served his time in exile. Maybe it was chance. But either way, he owed it to them and to the man he'd been before. The war broke him to fight for what was right instead of accepting what was easy. He put the photograph back in the trunk and lay down on his cot. Through the wall, he could hear the horses breathing, their presence a comfort in the darkness. Tomorrow he'd ride to Santa Fe and meet with Margaret Sutton's lawyer. Tomorrow he'd begin the real fight. But tonight he'd rest, knowing that he wasn't alone anymore. In his dreams, Sarah smiled at him the way she had in the photograph, and the mustangs ran free across land that stretched to the horizon, and somewhere in the distance, a small grey donkey brayed triumph at the rising sun. Santa Fe sprawled across the hillside like a city caught between two worlds. Spanish colonial architecture rubbing shoulders with newer American construction, ancient churches standing defiant next to banks and law offices. Caleb felt exposed walking its streets in his work clothes, aware of how he must look to the well-dressed businessmen and ladies in their bustles and bonnets. But Margaret Sutton's card carried weight, and the receptionist at the law office of Thomas Whitmore, Esquire, showed him to a waiting room without the disdain he'd expected. Whitmore himself appeared 20 minutes later, a man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that assessed Caleb in a single glance. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Sutton spoke highly of you, which is recommendation enough for me. Come in, please." The office was lined with law books and smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Whitmore gestured to a chair and settled behind his desk with the air of a man comfortable in his domain. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. The devil, as they say, lives in the details." Caleb talked for an hour. He described Dust's arrival, the daily feedings, the morning the mustangs appeared. He explained about Marcus Dalton's offer and threat, about the claim he'd filed, about the 20 witnesses who could testify to what they'd seen. Whitmore took notes, occasionally asking questions that seemed tangential but revealed themselves as relevant the more Caleb thought about them. "The donkey is key," Whitmore said when Caleb finished. "If we can establish that the mustangs were using him as a scout, that they'd been watching you specifically before they came in, it undermines Dalton's claim of simple capture on his property. It shows intent, deliberation, choice. How do we prove that? Testimony, observation. We find people who've seen those horses over the years, track their movements, show a pattern that places them in proximity to the broken spur for weeks before they appeared. We demonstrate that this wasn't random chance, but calculated decision-making on the part of highly intelligent animals. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. The challenge is that we're asking a court to recognize agency in animals, which goes against established precedent, but precedent can be set as well as followed. What are my chances? Honestly, 50-50 at best. Dalton's right that territorial law favors property owners in capture cases, but there are enough ambiguities: the open gate, the lack of physical capture, the witnesses to willing entry, that a sympathetic judge might rule in your favor. He paused. The real question is whether you're prepared for what comes next. Dalton won't stop at legal challenges. Men like him rarely do. Caleb thought about his empty leather pouch, his meager possessions, his 5 years of careful invisibility. I don't have much he can threaten me with. Everyone has something they can lose, Mr. Miller. The question is whether you value it enough to surrender when threatened. Whitmore pulled out a contract. This is a contingency agreement. I take your case. Do the work, and if we win, I receive 30% of whatever settlement or value we establish. If we lose, you owe me nothing. Are those terms acceptable? Caleb signed without hesitation. He'd come too far to turn back now. The ride back to the ranch took most of the day. By the time Caleb arrived, evening had settled across the land like a blanket, and the temperature had dropped enough that his breath misted in the air. He found trouble waiting for him in the form of 3 men standing by the corral, their horses tied to the rail, their attention fixed on the mustangs. Buck Ramsey stood apart from them, his expression troubled. When he saw Caleb approaching, he walked over quickly. They showed up about an hour ago. Been trying to get them to leave, but they're insisting on seeing the horses. The 3 men turned as Caleb dismounted. The one in the center, tall and heavy-set, with a face that suggested he'd spent his life outdoors, and most of it angry, stepped forward. You Miller? I am. Name's Tom Braddock. These are my boys, Jack and Samuel. He gestured to the 2 younger men flanking him, both cut from similar cloth. We're horse traders out of Denver. Word reached us about the Phantom Herd showing up here. We're prepared to make an offer. They're not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. We're talking $5,000, cash money. That's more than you'd see in 20 years of work. Caleb kept his voice level. Appreciate the offer, but my answer's the same. They're not for sale. You don't own them yet, Jack said, his voice carrying the hard edge of someone used to getting his way. Dalton claims them too. Maybe we ought to talk to him instead. You're welcome to try. But the horses won't go with him either. They're horses, not people. They go where we lead them. Samuel moved toward the corral, and immediately all 4 mustangs' heads came up, their ears pinned back, their bodies tensed for flight or fight. The change was instantaneous and total, from calm domestic animals to wild creatures ready to defend themselves. I wouldn't, Buck warned. Those horses got teeth and hooves, and they know how to use them. Samuel ignored him and reached for the corral gate. Captain charged the fence so fast, Samuel stumbled backward and fell. The stallion stopped just short of the rails, his head high, his eyes showing white. Behind him, the other 3 mustangs formed a line, a united front against threat. Braddock grabbed his son's arm and hauled him to his feet. Spirited. That'll make them worth more once they're broken proper. They're not broken, Caleb said quietly. They're choosing. There's a difference. No difference to me. Horse is a horse. Man's the one in charge. Braddock turned back to face Caleb. 5,000's my offer. You got 48 hours to think on it. After that, I'm talking to Dalton, and whatever deal he makes with me won't include you. They rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving Caleb and Buck standing by the corral. The mustangs remained alert, their bodies still tense, their trust in human nature damaged by the brief encounter. That's going to be a problem, Buck said. Everything's a problem these days. Yeah, but that's a special kind. Braddock's got a reputation, he gets what he wants, and he's not particular about how. Buck hesitated. "Listen, I know we haven't always. I gave you trouble. But what's happening here ain't right. Those horses came to you. That ought to count for something. Appreciate that." Buck nodded and walked away, leaving Caleb alone with the horses. He climbed into the corral, moving slowly, letting the mustangs see him clearly in the moonlight. Captain approached first, his initial wariness fading as he recognized Caleb's scent and manner. The stallion pressed his forehead against Caleb's chest, and Caleb wrapped his arms around the great horse's neck, feeling the warmth and life and trust that had been freely given. "I won't let them take you," he whispered. "Whatever it takes, I'll keep you safe." In the morning, he found a horseshoe nailed to his tackroom door, bent, twisted, damaged beyond use. The message was clear. Someone wanted him broken and discarded, just like the ruined shoe. But horseshoes could be reforged in fire, hammered back into shape, made stronger than before. Caleb took it down and put it in his pocket, a reminder that pressure didn't always lead to breaking. Sometimes it led to transformation. The letter arrived on a cold morning in early December, delivered by a postal rider who'd made a special trip from Santa Fe. It was addressed to Captain Caleb J. Miller in handwriting that made Caleb's hands shake as he accepted it. He recognized that script precise, disciplined, the product of years drilling penmanship into young officers who'd grow up to lead men into battle. He waited until evening to open it, after the day's work was done and the ranch had settled into its nightly rhythm. In the privacy of his tackroom, by lamplight that threw shadows across walls he'd stared at for 5 years, Caleb broke the seal and unfolded pages that would change everything. "Dear Caleb," it began, and just seeing his name written in that familiar hand made his throat tight. "If you're reading this, then the impossible has happened, and for once in this God-forsaken world, something went right." The letter was from Colonel William Henshaw, Caleb's commanding officer in the 7th Cavalry, a man Caleb hadn't seen or heard from since the regiment disbanded in 1873. Henshaw had been more than an officer. He'd been a mentor, a friend, the father Caleb's own father had never managed to be. When Caleb had spiraled into drinking after the war, Henshaw had tried to help. When Sarah left, Henshaw had written letters Caleb had been too proud and too ashamed to answer. Eventually, the letters stopped coming, and Caleb had assumed Henshaw had given up on him like everyone else. He'd been wrong. "I heard about the mustangs from my daughter Margaret," the letter continued, and Caleb's breath caught. Margaret Sutton. She hadn't mentioned her maiden name, hadn't revealed that connection. But now it made perfect sense why she'd helped, why she'd seemed to understand things she shouldn't have known. "I need to tell you something about those horses, Caleb. They're not just wild mustangs. They're descendants of cavalry mounts from our regiment specifically, from the remount station we established in '69, before things went bad. Do you remember Lieutenant James Cartwright?" Caleb did remember. James had been his best friend in the service, a young officer with more courage than sense and a gift for handling horses that bordered on supernatural. They'd served together for 3 years, fought side by side in a dozen engagements, covered each other's backs when the world exploded into chaos and blood. James had been killed in an ambush in Arizona Territory in 1871, shot from his horse before he could draw his weapon. Caleb had been the one to write to his widow, though he'd never found adequate words for the grief. James was breeding horses, the letter continued. Quality stock from cavalry surplus crossed with wild mustangs he'd captured and gentled. He believed you could breed for intelligence and temperament as much as speed and stamina. The army thought he was wasting resources, but I gave him latitude because his results were undeniable. When he died, I personally oversaw the release of his breeding stock rather than let them be sold to the highest bidder or worse, turned into glue. It seemed like what James would have wanted, giving them back their freedom. Caleb set the letter down, his mind reeling. Captain, Sterling, Blaze and Ranger weren't just wild horses. They were James Cartwright's legacy, animals bred by a man who'd understood that horses were partners, not tools. Animals that carried in their blood the same qualities James had valued: intelligence, courage, loyalty. He picked up the letter again, his hands steadier now, but his heart hammering. "Those horses have been running wild for 16 years, Caleb. Margaret's husband tracked them because I'd told him the story, hoping he might catch them and continue James's work. He failed, and it cost him his life. When I heard they'd appeared at a ranch in New Mexico, walked in of their own accord, I made inquiries. Imagine my shock when I learned the man they'd chosen was you. Do you understand what that means?" Caleb wasn't sure he did, but he kept reading. James used to talk about the bond between horse and rider, how it transcended training and became something almost mystical when both parties respected each other. He believed horses could recognize good men, that they remembered kindness across generations. I thought it was romantic nonsense, the kind of thing young idealists tell themselves to make sense of a brutal world. But maybe James was right. Maybe those horses recognized something in you, not just kindness, but a connection to the man who bred their ancestors with love and care. Maybe they came home to you because, in some way, you represent the home they lost when James died. The letter concluded with practical matters: Henshaw's offer to provide written testimony about the horse's lineage, his willingness to testify in court if needed, his assurance that Caleb's claim had merit beyond simple capture law. But Caleb barely processed those details. His mind was stuck on the revelation that the horses had chosen him not randomly but deliberately, drawn by something deeper than the oats he'd shared with Dust. He walked out to the corral where the mustangs stood in the moonlight. Captain raised his head, watching Caleb approach with those intelligent dark eyes. Caleb climbed the fence and dropped into the enclosure, a dangerous move with wild horses, but they didn't scatter. Instead, they gathered around him, Captain pressing against his left side, Sterling on his right, Blaze and Ranger flanking them all. "You knew," Caleb said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Somehow you knew what James meant to me. Maybe you carry his memory in your bones, or maybe you're smarter than any of us gave you credit for. Either way, you found your way to the one person who'd understand what you represent." James Cartwright had believed in the bond between horse and rider, in mutual respect and partnership. He'd died before seeing his breeding program succeed, before knowing that his horses would carry those values into the next generation and the one after that. But his work had survived him, running wild and free across the territory until the day his horses decided to come in from the cold and trust a man James had once called brother. Caleb leaned against Captain's warm bulk and let himself feel the full weight of what had been given to him. This wasn't just about ownership or money or legal battles. This was about legacy. James's legacy, passed down through generations of horses, finding its way back to someone who'd known the man and shared his values. This was about second chances, about the universe occasionally getting things right, about wild creatures making a choice that honored the memory of a man who'd honored them. "I understand now," Caleb whispered. "You didn't just come to me. You came home." In the distance, Dust brayed softly. The small grey donkey had been the first to test whether this place and this man were worthy. He'd reported back to the herd that it was safe, that this human understood what it meant to care without demanding, to give without expecting return, to see value in creatures others dismissed. Dust had been the scout, but more than that, he'd been the key that unlocked a connection 16 years in the making. Caleb pulled Colonel Henshaw's letter from his pocket and read it again by moonlight. Near the end, Henshaw had written, "I failed you after the war, Caleb. I saw you struggling and didn't push hard enough to pull you back from the edge. I've regretted that for years. But maybe this is my chance to make amends. Maybe James's horses found you because you're exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. Sometimes our failures lead us to our purpose. I'm praying that's true for both of us." Caleb folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. Tomorrow he'd ride to town and telegraph Henshaw. Tomorrow he'd give this information to Whitmore and let the lawyer figure out how to use it. Tomorrow he'd face whatever challenges Dalton and Braddock and the legal system threw at him. But tonight he stood surrounded by horses that had chosen him not despite his past but because of it, and he let himself believe that maybe redemption wasn't something you earned, but something that found you when you stopped running from who you'd been and started living with who you'd become. Thomas Whitmore read Colonel Henshaw's letter 3 times, his expression growing more animated with each pass. "This changes everything," he said finally, setting the paper on his desk with the reverence usually reserved for holy texts. "Documented lineage, eyewitness testimony from a respected military officer. A direct connection between you and the horse's breeder." Dalton's case just got significantly weaker. Caleb sat across from him in the Santa Fe office, trying to match the lawyer's enthusiasm, but finding himself weighted down by doubt. It's still speculation about what the horses knew or remembered. How do we prove they came to me specifically because of James? We don't have to prove intent definitively. We just have to establish reasonable doubt about Dalton's claim of simple capture. The lineage alone does that. These aren't pure wild mustangs with no ownership history. They're descended from cavalry stock that was deliberately released. That muddies the legal waters considerably. Whitmore pulled out a map and spread it across his desk. Now, we need to track their movements over the past year. If we can show they were in proximity to the broken spur for weeks or months before appearing, it strengthens the argument of deliberate choice rather than random wandering. Over the next week, Caleb rode across 3 counties, talking to ranchers, farmers, and travelers who'd seen the Phantom Herd. An old shepherd near Silver City reported seeing them in August, watching a ranch from a hillside for several days before moving on. A freight hauler from Lordsburg had spotted them in September, crossing the road at dawn like ghosts made flesh. Each sighting drew a line on Whitmore's map, and those lines converged on the Broken Spur Ranch with unmistakable intention. "They were searching for something," Whitmore said, as he marked the final location. "Or someone. This pattern isn't random migration. It's systematic exploration of ranches in the region, as if they were looking for specific criteria. Looking for someone who'd treat a donkey with kindness," Caleb said quietly. "Exactly. And that, Mr. Miller, is what we'll argue in court." But gathering evidence was only half the battle. While Caleb built his case, Marcus Dalton marshaled his own forces. He brought in expert witnesses who'd testify that wild horses followed water and grass, not moral principles. He hired surveyors to prove the mustangs had crossed onto his property before entering the corral, establishing his prior claim. He even approached several of the Broken Spur's ranch hands with offers of money in exchange for testimony that would benefit his case. Most refused, their loyalty to Caleb having grown in unexpected ways. But Red Jeffries, always practical about matters of self-interest, accepted $200 to testify that he'd seen Caleb deliberately lure the horses with feed, undermining the argument of voluntary choice. Buck told Caleb about the betrayal over coffee one morning, his face troubled. "Red's saying you set bait traps for weeks, that the horses came because they were hungry, not because they chose you special. Says you manipulated the whole thing." Caleb absorbed this without surprise. He's lying, but he's being paid to lie. Can't blame a man for taking money when it's offered. "I can and do. There's a difference between earning wages and selling your integrity." Buck set down his cup hard enough that coffee slopped over the rim. "I'm testifying for you. So's Silas. So's most of the hands. We saw what we saw, and no amount of money's going to change that. Appreciate it, but you'll make enemies testifying against Dalton. He owns this ranch. Could cost you your jobs. Then it'll cost us." Buck met Caleb's eyes directly. "Some things matter more than keeping a job. A man's got to be able to look at himself in the mirror." Tom Braddock, meanwhile, hadn't given up his interest in the horses. He appeared at the ranch twice more, each time raising his offer $6,000, then $7,000, cash money that would set Caleb up for life if he'd just signed them over. When Caleb refused again, Braddock's tone shifted from persuasive to threatening. "You're making a mistake," he said during his final visit, his sons flanking him like attack dogs barely restrained. "Dalton's going to win in court, and when he does, he'll sell those horses to me anyway. The only difference is you'll walk away with nothing instead of $7,000 and a chance to start over somewhere else. Then I'll walk away with nothing, but at least I'll walk away knowing I didn't betray them. They're horses, not people. You can't betray something that doesn't understand loyalty." Caleb thought about Captain pressing his forehead against his chest, about 16 years of freedom given up for trust, about James Cartwright's belief in the bond between horse and rider. "You're wrong about that. They understand it better than most people I've known." After Braddock left, Caleb found a brand leaning against the stable door, a heavy iron tool with a B worked into its business end. The message was clear. One way or another, Braddock intended to mark those horses as his property. Caleb picked up the brand and threw it into the water trough, watching it sink like the threat it represented. The court date was set for December 20th, 3 weeks away. Whitmore worked 16-hour days preparing the case, taking depositions from witnesses, researching precedents, building an argument that would convince a territorial judge that horses could choose and that choice mattered more than property lines. Caleb continued his work at the ranch, caring for the mustangs and the regular horses with the same steady devotion, aware that every day might be one of the last he spent with them. Margaret Sutton visited twice more, bringing supplies and encouragement in equal measure. "My father's coming to testify," she said during her second visit. "He's traveling from Montana, where he's been living since he retired. Says he wouldn't miss this for the world. He's risking a lot going against Dalton. Man like that doesn't forget people who oppose him. My father's never been afraid of powerful men. It's one of his more admirable and infuriating qualities." She smiled, but her eyes were sad. "He feels he failed you once. This is his chance to make it right." "He didn't fail me. I failed myself." "Maybe you both get a second chance then. Funny how those work out sometimes." Colonel Henshaw arrived a week before the trial, stepping off the train in Santa Fe like a man marching into battle. He'd aged since Caleb last saw him, more grey in his hair, deeper lines in his face, but his bearing remained military straight, his handshake firm enough to crack walnuts. "You look better than you did last time I saw you," Henshaw said without preamble, steady, clear-eyed, like the man I remember from before the war took pieces of us all. "I'm trying, sir." "Don't call me sir. We're not in the army anymore, and you're not under my command. Call me William, or Bill if you're feeling familiar." He clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "Now, show me these horses that had the good sense to find you." They walked to the ranch together, talking about old times and lost friends, and the way life had a habit of circling back on itself when you least expected it. When they reached the stable and Henshaw saw the mustangs, he stopped abruptly, his eyes filling with tears he didn't bother hiding. My God, they looked just like the ones James was breeding. That bay has the same stance James's favorite stallion had, the same intelligence in his eyes. He walked closer, extending his hand the way Caleb had that first morning. Captain came to him immediately, pressing his nose into Henshaw's palm with the same gesture of trust he'd shown Caleb. "He knows," Henshaw said, his voice rough. "Somehow this horse knows I'm connected to James. Animals don't forget. They carry memory in their blood and pass it down like inheritance." That night, Whitmore gathered everyone in his Santa Fe office, Caleb, Henshaw, Margaret, and the key witnesses who'd testify in court. He laid out the case methodically, explaining what each person would say and how it fit into the larger argument. The core was simple. These horses weren't property to be claimed, but living creatures who'd made a deliberate choice, and that choice deserved legal recognition. "Dalton's lawyers will argue precedent," Whitmore said. "They'll say animals have no standing to choose, that property law is clear about capture and boundaries. Our job is to make the judge see these horses as something more than simple property. We need to establish that their lineage, their intelligence, and their deliberate actions create a unique circumstance that existing law doesn't adequately address. And if the judge doesn't see it that way, Caleb asked, then we appeal. And if we lose the appeal, we take it to Territorial Supreme Court. This case is important, Mr. Miller, not just for you and these horses, but for how we understand the relationship between humans and animals. James Cartwright believed that relationship was sacred. Let's prove he was right. As the meeting broke up and people filed out into the cold December night, Henshaw pulled Caleb aside. Whatever happens in court, you've already won something important. You've given those horses exactly what James wanted them, to have freedom and respect and someone who understands what they represent. That's worth more than any legal victory. But I'd still like the legal victory too. So would I, Henshaw smiled. Let's go get it. 3 days before the trial, Caleb woke to find the stable door open and the mustangs' stalls empty. For one terrible moment, he thought they'd been stolen, but then he saw them in the corral, standing in the exact formation they'd held. That first morning, a semicircle around dusk, facing the stable door, waiting. When Caleb appeared, Captain nickered softly, and all 4 horses lowered their heads in the gesture he'd learned to recognize as trust and acceptance. They were reminding him why they'd come, reminding him what was at stake, telling him in the only language they had that they'd chosen him and would choose him again, whatever came next. Caleb walked into the corral and stood among them, his hands on Captain's neck, his face pressed against the stallion's warm shoulder. "I won't let you down," he promised. "Whatever it takes, I'll fight for you." The trial would begin in 3 days. 3 days to prepare, to rehearse, to steel himself for a fight that would determine not just ownership but meaning, not just possession but purpose. Caleb had spent 5 years trying to become invisible. Now he'd stand in front of a judge in the territory and declare that he mattered, that these horses mattered, that the choice they'd made together deserved to be honored. He was ready, or as ready as any man could be, when everything he valued hung in the balance. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe was a building that took itself seriously. Thick adobe walls, high ceilings, windows that filtered sunlight into somber shafts of illumination that fell across polished wooden benches like judgment itself. Judge Harold Morrison presided from his elevated bench, a man in his 60s with white hair and a face that gave away nothing. He'd heard thousands of cases in his 30 years on the bench, everything from claim disputes to murder trials, and his reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for nonsense. The courtroom filled early. Ranchers and townspeople, sensing a case that might set precedent, crowded the gallery until the bailiff had to turn people away at the door. Caleb sat at the defendant's table beside Thomas Whitmore, his hands folded in his lap, his best clothes borrowed from Colonel Henshaw, hanging slightly loose on his frame. Across the aisle, Marcus Dalton sat with his lawyer, Harrison Webb, a man whose expensive suit and confident bearing announced his belief that this case was already won. Judge Morrison called the court to order with 3 strikes of his gavel, and the battle began. Webb stood first, his opening statement delivered with the practiced ease of someone who'd won more cases than he'd lost. "Your Honor, this case is remarkably simple, despite attempts to complicate it. Wild horses entered property belonging to my client, Marcus Dalton. Under territorial law, those horses became his property through right of capture. The defendant, an employee of Mr. Dalton, has attempted to assert ownership based on nothing more than sentiment and the claim that the horses chose him. But animals don't choose. They respond to food, shelter, and opportunity. My client provided all 3 through his ranch facilities. The law is clear. The horses belong to Mr. Dalton." He called his first witness a surveyor who testified that the mustangs had crossed Dalton's property line at least 50 yards before entering the corral. He produced maps and measurements, transforming what had been a moment of almost mystical connection into a simple matter of property boundaries and trespass law. Red Jeffries took the stand next, his discomfort visible in every fidget and sideways glance. Under Webb's questioning, he described seeing Caleb set out bait near the corral in the weeks before the mustangs appeared, suggesting deliberate luring rather than spontaneous choice. "And did Mr. Miller ever express interest in capturing these specific horses?" Webb asked. Red hesitated, then nodded. "He talked about them sometimes, said it would be something special if they ever came in. So he had advanced knowledge of their value and took deliberate steps to attract them to property owned by someone else? I suppose that's one way to look at it." Whitmore rose for cross-examination, his movements unhurried. "Mr. Jeffries, this bait you mentioned, what exactly was it?" "Oats, horse feed." "And where did Mr. Miller place this feed?" "Near the corral, just outside it mostly." "For the horses?" Red shifted in his seat. "Well, no, for the donkey, but the horses could have seen it." "Could have? But did you ever see the mustangs eating this feed before the morning they appeared?" "No." "Did you ever see them anywhere near the corral before that morning?" "No." "So this bait was for a donkey, not wild horses, and the wild horses never took it until the morning they walked in of their own accord. Is that accurate?" Red's face reddened. "I guess so, yeah." No further questions. Webb called 2 more witnesses, ranchers, who testified to the value of the horses and their own unsuccessful attempts to capture them. Each established that the Phantom Herd was legendary, elusive, worth a fortune. Each implied that only through luck or trickery could anyone have brought them in. Then Whitmore stood for the defense, and the narrative shifted. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about property law, but it's also about something more fundamental, the question of whether choice matters when animals are involved. We intend to show that these horses didn't wander onto Mr. Dalton's property by accident. They didn't respond to bait or opportunity. They made a deliberate decision based on observation, assessment, and trust. And that decision, we argue, deserves legal recognition." He called Colonel William Henshaw to the stand first. Henshaw testified about James Cartwright's breeding program, about the deliberate release of the horses after James's death, about the qualities James had bred for: intelligence, judgment, the ability to assess human character. "These horses aren't simple animals responding to base instinct," Henshaw said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "They're the product of years of selective breeding, designed specifically to create horses that could think, evaluate, and choose worthy partners. James believed horses had that capacity, and everything we're seeing suggests he was right." Webb cross-examined aggressively. "Colonel, isn't it true that you're a friend of the defendant?" "I was his commanding officer. We served together." "And isn't it true that you feel guilty about not helping him after the war, and this testimony is motivated by that guilt rather than fact?" Henshaw's eyes went hard. "My testimony is motivated by truth. Whether that makes you uncomfortable is your problem, not mine." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "The witness will stick to answering questions. Mr. Webb, you'll avoid editorializing. Continue." Whitmore called witness after witness, building a case not just of fact, but of meaning. The old shepherd testified about seeing the horses observe ranches for days at a time, as if evaluating them. The freight hauler described how the mustangs had crossed his path without spooking, looking at him directly before moving on, as if they'd assessed him and found him wanting. Buck Ramsey took the stand and described the morning of their arrival with such detail and conviction that several people in the gallery nodded along, remembering their own presence at that impossible moment. Finally, Whitmore called Caleb to the stand. "Mr. Miller, tell us about the morning of November 23rd. Caleb spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He described waking to silence, finding the horses in the corral, the way they'd stood calm and waiting instead of wild and trapped. He talked about the rope halter he'd made for Dust, and how Captain had accepted it without resistance. He explained about feeding the donkey every morning, not as bait, but as an act of basic decency to a creature that needed help. "Did you ever expect the mustangs to appear?" Whitmore asked. "No. Never crossed my mind that they would." Yet you'd heard of them? The Phantom Herd? Everyone had, but you hear about a lot of things that don't come true. I just did my work and tried to do right by the animals in my care, including a donkey nobody else thought was worth noticing, especially him. He reminded me of myself, I guess. Something the world had discarded, still standing when he had every reason to quit. Webb approached for cross-examination, his expression sharp. "Mr. Miller, you're asking this court to believe that wild horses evaluated your moral character and decided you were worthy. Do you realize how that sounds?" "I realize how it sounds. I also know what I saw. Those horses weren't captured. They came in of their own will, because of food. I fed one small donkey a handful of oats each morning. That's not enough to attract 4 full-grown mustangs. They came for something else." "What then? Love?" Webb's tone was mocking. "Trust," Caleb said quietly. "They came because they'd watched me long enough to believe I wouldn't hurt them, that I'd treat them the way their breeder, Lieutenant James Cartwright, believed horses should be treated, as partners, not property." "You never knew Lieutenant Cartwright?" "I knew him better than most. He was my best friend for 3 years. He died in my arms in Arizona Territory in 1871, asking me to remember what he'd taught me about horses and honor and doing right by creatures that depended on us." Caleb's voice remained steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "I lost my way after the war, lost everything that mattered, but I never forgot what James believed. And when his horses found me, it felt like being given a second chance to honor his memory." The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even Webb seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, are you saying these horses carry some kind of genetic memory of their breeder?" "I don't know about genetics, Your Honor, but I know horses are smarter than most people give them credit for. They remember, they assess, they choose. Maybe they knew James, or maybe they just knew kindness when they saw it. Either way, they chose me, and I'm asking you to recognize that choice as mattering more than property lines." Morrison sat back, his expression thoughtful. "I'm going to take a recess to consider what I've heard. Court will resume in 1 hour." The wait felt eternal. Caleb stood outside the courthouse with Henshaw and Margaret, watching people stream past, some offering encouraging words, others avoiding his eyes completely. Tom Braddock appeared briefly, shook his head as if Caleb had disappointed him personally, and left without speaking. When court resumed, Judge Morrison looked tired, as if the weight of his decision had aged him during the recess. "I've reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the applicable territorial law. This case presents an unusual circumstance that doesn't fit neatly into existing precedent." He paused, and in that pause, Caleb's entire future hung suspended. "The law regarding wild animal capture is clear generally. Animals on one's property may be claimed. However, the testimony regarding these horses' lineage, their documented intelligence, and the unusual circumstances of their voluntary entry creates reasonable doubt about whether standard capture law applies. More significantly, Mr. Miller's relationship with the horses, demonstrated through their willingness to accept handling and their distress when others approached, suggests a bond that transcends simple property claims." Morrison picked up his gavel. "I'm ruling in favor of the defendant. The horses are declared the property of Caleb Miller, with the stipulation that he must provide adequate care and may not sell them for a period of 2 years. This gives the horses legal protection and ensures they remain with the person they chose. Mr. Dalton, while I appreciate your position, I cannot ignore the unique circumstances this case presents. Sometimes the law must adapt to recognize what justice demands rather than what precedent suggests." The gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted. Caleb sat stunned, barely processing the hands shaking the congratulations being offered, Whitmore's triumphant grin. Henshaw embraced him with tears in his eyes, and Margaret kissed his cheek, laughing. He'd won. Against all odds and expectations, he'd won. Spring came to New Mexico territory, with its usual burst of green across the high desert, wildflowers painting the landscape in colors that seemed impossible after winter's browns and grays. Caleb stood at the fence of his new property, 6 acres purchased with money he'd earned from training horses for ranchers who'd heard about the man wild mustangs had chosen and watched Captain and his 3 companions run across. Grass that belonged to them now, truly and completely. The 2-year waiting period Judge Morrison had imposed had passed, and Caleb had honored it completely. He'd refused every offer to purchase the horses, turned away Tom Braddock and a dozen others who'd arrived with increasingly large sums of cash. The horses weren't for sale then, and they weren't for sale now. They'd chosen him, and he'd chosen them back, and some things mattered more than money. The property wasn't grand, just a small stable, a modest cabin, and enough pasture to let the horses roam during the day. But it was his, purchased free and clear with no debt and no one to answer to, except the animals in his care. He'd named it Cartwright Stables, a tribute to the man whose vision had created these horses and whose friendship had shaped the man Caleb tried to be. A sign hung over the stable door, hand-carved by a craftsman in Santa Fe and paid for by Colonel Henshaw as a gift. It read, "Cartwright Stables, where horses choose their people." Caleb had protested the expense, but Henshaw had insisted, saying James would have loved the sentiment and the story behind it. Dust dozed in the sun near the stable entrance, his grey coat gleaming with good health, his torn ear, a permanent reminder of where he'd come from and how far he'd travelled. He'd become something of a local celebrity, the donkey who'd brought in the Phantom Herd, and children from nearby ranches sometimes visited just to see him and offer treats. He accepted their attention with patient dignity, as if he'd always known his worth, even when no one else did. The past 2 years had changed more than Caleb's circumstances. Word of the trial had spread across the territory, and people had begun bringing him horses that needed special handling, animals traumatized by poor treatment, young horses no one else could gentle, problem cases that seemed hopeless. Caleb took them all, working with each using the principles James Cartwright had believed in: patience, respect, partnership, rather than domination. He'd discovered he had a gift for it, or perhaps he'd rediscovered a gift he'd buried beneath years of self-destruction and shame. Either way, the work gave him purpose, and the horses gave him peace. Some nights, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the stars spread across the sky like hope made visible, he thought about Sarah and wondered if she'd heard about what happened. He didn't contact her, too much time had passed, too much damage had been done, but he hoped she was happy, hoped she'd found with her new husband the stability he'd been unable to provide. Colonel Henshaw visited often, usually bringing his daughter Margaret, who'd become friends with Caleb in the easy way people do when they've shared something meaningful. They'd talk about horses and James and the peculiar justice of the universe occasionally getting things right. Henshaw had aged visibly since the trial, his health declining in ways that concerned Margaret, but his spirits remained strong. "You've done James proud," he told Caleb during one visit. The 2 of them sitting on the cabin's small porch while the horses grazed in the evening light, not just with the horses, but with your life. "You took what you were given, the good and the bad, and built something honest from it. That's all any of us can hope to do." "I had help," Caleb said. "You, Margaret, Whitmore, even Buck and Silas from the ranch, couldn't have done it alone. No one ever does. But you had to be willing to accept that help, willing to fight for something that mattered. That's the hard part." Henshaw was quiet for a moment, watching Captain run across the pasture, his black mane flying. "James believed horses could teach us how to be better people if we paid attention. I think he was right. Those horses taught you what he couldn't, that you were worth saving." After Henshaw left, Caleb walked out to the pasture where the 4 mustangs had gathered to watch the sunset, as they did most evenings. They came to him immediately, pressing close, accepting the scratches and gentle words he offered. Captain lowered his head to rest against Caleb's chest, a gesture of trust that still moved him every time it happened. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, speaking to the horses, to James's memory, to whatever force in the universe had decided he deserved another chance, for seeing something in me I couldn't see in myself, for choosing me when I was nobody worth choosing, for reminding me that the past doesn't have to determine the future. The horses stood with him as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, and somewhere a nightjar called. The desert evening wrapped around them all, man, horses, donkey, in the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Caleb thought about the morning those horses had appeared in his corral, about the impossible gift they'd given him, simply by trusting that he'd treat them with kindness. He thought about all the mornings since, waking with purpose instead of regret, working with hands that created instead of destroyed. He thought about legacy and redemption, and the long road from despair to hope. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echoed the loudest across the wilderness. Sometimes feeding a starving donkey was enough to change everything. Sometimes wild creatures saw the truth in people better than people saw it in themselves, and their choice transformed not just a moment, but a lifetime. As darkness settled and stars began to emerge, Caleb walked back to his cabin with the horses following behind, still close, still trusting. Tomorrow he'd begin working with a new horse a rancher was bringing over, an animal everyone else had given up on. But tonight, he'd sit on his porch and breathe in the desert air and feel grateful for second chances, for wild horses that chose wisely, and for the grace of being given another opportunity to honor the memory of a friend who'd believed horses and people could be better than the world expected them to be. He'd lost so much over the years, rank, marriage, property, pride, but he'd found something more valuable in return: purpose, peace, and proof that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future worthy of the chances you'd been given. The horses had taught him that. A small grey donkey had led him there, and now, finally, Caleb Miller knew what it meant to be home.